What if the reason you feel constantly stressed, distracted, or mentally tired isn't your job, your money, or your situation? What if it's because you're putting your energy into things you were never meant to control? Be honest with yourself for a second. In 2026, life is louder than ever. You wake up, reach for your phone, and before your feet even touch the floor, your mind is already full. Messages, news, opinions, comparisons. It feels like you're reacting all day instead of living. Most people think this is just how life is now. It's not. Thousands of years ago, people lived through war, disease, uncertainty, and loss. And yet some of them learned how to stay calm, focused, and steady no matter what happened around them. That way of thinking is Stoicism, not the quote version, not the aesthetic version, the real one. At the center of Stoicism is a simple idea that almost everyone understands, but very few people actually live by. Some things are in your control. Most things are not. Your effort is in your control. Your discipline is in your control. Your response is in your control. Other people's behavior isn't. The past isn't. The future isn't. And yet, think about this for a moment. How much of your stress comes from things you can't control at all? That's where most people in 2026 get stuck. They ignore what's in their hands and obsess over what isn't. They replay conversations. They imagine worst-case futures. They carry emotional weight that was never theirs to carry. And then they wonder why they're exhausted. A Stoic doesn't expect life to be easy. They expect it to be challenging. Not in a pessimistic way, in a prepared way. So when something goes wrong, it doesn't feel like the world is collapsing. It feels like something they trained for. Imagine waking up and seeing bad news on your phone. Most people spiral immediately. Their mood drops. Their focus disappears. The entire day is ruined. A Stoic pauses, not because they don't care, but because they understand something most people don't. The event already happened. The panic is optional. Here's something important, and most people never hear it clearly enough. Calm is not a personality trait. Calm is a skill. And skills can be trained. Stoicism teaches you to slow down that automatic reaction and ask one simple question before you respond emotionally. Is this actually within my control? If it is, act. If it isn't, release it. That single habit can remove an unbelievable amount of unnecessary suffering from your life. Marcus Aurelius used to write every morning, knowing the day would be difficult. He didn't wake up hoping things would go smoothly. He prepared himself to handle whatever came with dignity and control. In a world like 2026, that mindset is rare and powerful. You stop asking, why does this always happen to me? And you start asking, what's the right response here? Stoicism isn't about motivation, it's about discipline. Doing what needs to be done, even when you don't feel like it. Choosing long-term strength over short-term comfort. While most people chase dopamine, Stoics build resilience. While most people react emotionally, Stoics respond deliberately. That pause between stimulus and response, that's where your power lives. Most people never develop it. And that's why most people stay stressed. Now listen closely, because this is the idea that truly changes how you experience life. You are not disturbed by events. You are disturbed by the meaning you give them. The same event can destroy one person and strengthen another. The difference isn't the event, it's the interpretation. Change the meaning, and the event loses its grip on you. That's not theory. That's freedom. In 2026, the world isn't going to slow down. People won't suddenly become easier. Problems won't disappear. But Stoicism doesn't promise you control over the world. It gives you control over yourself. And once you have that, very little can shake you. If this resonated with you, stay here. This channel is for people who want inner strength in a noisy world. And the next video might be exactly what you need.